Hey, I'm Mark, and in this video, I'll be building a modular shelving and desk system out of construction lumber and steel. My new studio space has enough room to set up a retail display. I wanted to create something simple and modern looking, but more importantly, a system that would allow for changes as I introduce new products or want to refresh the area. Now, time to see how I go from the idea in my head to the space on my wall. I'm using construction lumber because it is typically affordable and readily available, though manufacturing shortages this year have caused prices to go up. The construction lumber does have rough sides that you'll see me flattening and squaring up by using the joiner. Once I had 2 square faces, I was able to make a rough pass down to 5 1/4 inches on the table saw to make either side parallel. I ran the other rough face through the wide belt sander. This side isn't super critical, as it will be facing the wall and not visible, but having it flat does help with assembly later on. I went back to the table saw to cut the stud to its final width of 5 inches, and then I was ready to cut the slots along each side. Aren't those ribbons of wood so cool? The walls of my studio are 10 feet, but I decided to keep the display at 8 feet to keep everything more in reach. I cut one end off camera and made the final cut here on the miter saw. And yes, the saw is tilted off 90 degrees. That was not my intention. It didn't mess anything up, thankfully, as I could put the sign on top. I decided that I wanted the shelves to be adjustable to 12 inches, so I created a jig using a crosscut saw and a scrap piece of 1/8 inch angle steel that will be used for the shelf mounts. By screwing the angle steel 12 inches off of the saw blade and gradually moving each new cut along the jig, it would assure that all studs on the wall would have slots at the same height, meaning my shelves wouldn't end up with issues of not being level once installed. I used the random orbit sander up to 220 grit to get all 4 sides nice and smooth, and used a sanding sponge to soften the sharp edges just a bit. Because I wasn't sure how snug the angle steel would fit into the slots, and to make sure shelves wouldn't go falling out on me, I 3D printed a hole jig to use for drilling pilot holes above each slot. Though after assembly, I found that the holes weren't really necessary because the steel had a good tolerance fit into the slots. However, this does give me more flexibility for mounting other objects in the future, which is the goal of this project. As for finish, I like the modern look that water-based products allow for, specifically with whitewoods and pine. It brings a small amount of yellow out, but mostly looks like bare wood while providing protection and a nice finish of your choice, whether that be glossy, satin, or matte. I happen to have an open gallon of urethane formulated specifically for hardwood floors. While this is overkill and definitely not necessary for this project, because I had it, I figured I'd take advantage of it. Though this isn't a rub-on specific product, I found that with careful application, it still went on very nicely. When it came to mounting this to the wall, that was one main detail that I waited to figure out once I was further along in fabrication. I originally planned on mounting each individual stud with drywall anchors, since I wouldn't be hitting studs on this wall setup, but I decided that it would be too many holes and unnecessary amounts of work. Instead, I opted to take pieces of 1 inch angle steel, the same steel that I'm using for shelf sides, and mount that at the top and bottom of each stud. I laid out the angle steel to make marks for mounting holes. I used the drill press to make 12 holes, 2 for each stud on each piece of angle, and then placed them back on the studs. I then drilled pilot holes into the wood studs using a piece of tape on the drill bit to ensure that I didn't drill too deep. And finally, using wood screws, I mounted the angle steel to each stud. I'm only showing clips of me attaching one piece of angle steel because you get the point. Now for the shelves. To add an extra level of dynamic design to this system, I went for shelves that varied both in depth, some being 6 inches deep and others 9 inches deep, and in length, spanning 2, 3, and 4 of the studs in length. Obviously, all of these dimensions can be tweaked to your preference. So I started by measuring out and roughly cutting the lumber, 2x4s in this instance. Then off camera, ran them over the joiner that you saw earlier, and finally glued them up using some clamps. Once the glue dried, I removed the clamps and took the shelf back to the planer to get a nice flat face and edge. Pardon the wedgie shot. trying to keep this video PG. Finally, for the angled steel sides for the shelves, they were very simple. Using the horizontal bandsaw, I was able to cut multiple pieces of angled steel to length and cleaned up the edges on the belt grinder. Now for mounting this thing to the wall. This was another part that I didn't finalize the design on until later into the project. I decided to fabricate mounting pegs with a piece of scrap angled steel and 2x4. The idea is to first mount the first face of angled steel into a drywall anchor. Once done, use 2 wood screws from the top to mount the peg into the anchored steel. I put the wall structure back into place, and I used a piece of blue painter's tape to figure out where the hole for the anchor would need to go in order to mount the steel. Once the tape was in place, I moved the wall assembly out of the way, drilled a pilot hole into the drywall, and then installed my wall anchor. And yes, I do think I'll win an award for Best Camera Angle of the Year with this shot. Once done, I either tripped or pranced back towards the wall, I'm not really sure, and marked the hole location for the other 3 support pegs. I knew 4 supports would be the minimum to keep the wall supported and plumb, and figured that I'd add more later if the wall wiggled too much or felt weak. So far, from my experience, it seems good with the 4 that I already installed. Then I attached the other 3 pegs, put the wall assembly back into place, and marked drill holes for the 2 pieces of angled steel on the wall assembly. I drilled those holes and used more wood screws to finally anchor the assembly to the wall. From there, I added the shelves and angled steel sides that I had made earlier, as well as the LED lighting and my desk. In my next video, I'll be showing you how to mount the LED lights and create the desktop and steel legs. Thanks for watching. Bye.